Part 1. The boy who asked the wrong questions. Before anyone started calling you the one with the wheel, you were just a quiet child in a smoky little cottage that smelled like wet hay and boiled onions. You weren't born to torment. No one is. Like most kids in your village, your hands were meant to learn woodwork, gather herbs, or chase geese, not polish shackles. But something was different about you. While other children fought with sticks, pretending to be knights, you were behind the bakery, poking at frog guts, and asking your mother questions like, do bones snap the same way in pigs and people? Not in a charming future healer way, more like in a keep this child away from fire way. You weren't cruel, you were curious. And in a medieval town, curiosity wasn't a gift, it was a red flag. Your father was probably a butcher or a cooper, someone who dealt with meat or barrels and didn't mind the smell of iron. Your mother might have whispered old herbal remedies to neighbors, mixing poultices that worked a little too well to be entirely comforting. You weren't blessed or cursed. You were simply available. Then one day, a local official looked at your still face, steady hands, and the way you didn't flinch when a goat broke its leg, and said the medieval version of he'll do. Part 2. The man with the apron and the bucket. You didn't begin your training with swords or scrolls. You were sent to live with a man they called Uncle Grior. Not really your uncle, but no one corrected it. His house was outside the village, not suspiciously far, but far enough that church bells didn't reach it. He didn't smile. He didn't speak much either. Just pointed at a bench, a hook, a dark bucket in the corner. You didn't ask what anything was for. That was rule 1. The house had no garden, just ropes, locked doors, and a smell that stuck to your skin. Grior taught you practical things: how to boil water, oil wooden cranks, clean rust from iron, and wrap cloth around your hands so the splinters didn't draw blood. But he never told you what you were becoming. That was rule 2. Part 3. Learning without words. Your first lessons weren't written. They came in gestures and glances, in tasks repeated in silence. You learned how to clean iron cuffs, how to scrape dried stains from wood, how to listen for creaks in stone stairs that meant someone was coming when they shouldn't. At night, you barely slept, not because of fear, but because the building whispered. The floor creaked beneath your room. Sometimes you thought you heard breathing where there shouldn't be breath. You didn't complain. Grior gave you your first book, not scripture, but anatomy, written in a language you couldn't pronounce, but somehow understood. Pages filled with diagrams of bones and warnings about pressure points. You were 13. You still had soft hands, but not for long. Part 4. The basement key. No ceremony marked your promotion. Just a heavy iron key dropped into your palm one morning as Grior muttered, "You know the way." The door creaked open like it hadn't moved in years. Down the stone steps you went, torch in hand, heart in your throat. The basement wasn't large, but it was dense, dense with silence, with shadow, with intention. In the center, a table. Around it, ropes hanging like forgotten limbs. A wheel mounted on one wall. A chair bolted to the floor. And in the corner, that same bucket. You still didn't know why it was always there. That day, you didn't do anything. You just watched. A man was brought in. You saw what the job really meant. And when it was done, Grior handed you a rag and said, "Start cleaning." Part 5, the uniform. Your first promotion wasn't a badge. It was an apron made of cracked leather and a pair of gloves that had held too many things no one wanted to name. They didn't fit perfectly, but they fit enough. The gloves were heavy, reinforced. The apron smelled like vinegar and something older than rust. Splinters are worse than screams, Grior had said, handing them over. There was no mask, no hood, no way to hide who you were. People saw your gloves and boots and crossed the road. Even if you wore church clothes, they knew. The posture gave you away, alert, careful, always ready for something awful to happen. Part 6, the house behind the hall. They gave you your own place. A stone box near the municipal building, too close to the dungeon to be accidental. No one else lived nearby. No one wanted to. The walls were thick. That helped. The doors locked. That helped more. But the nights were loud, not with noise, but with memory. Chains shifting in the dark. Footsteps when no one was on duty. You hung a tapestry once. It fell by morning. Even decoration refused to stay. A priest dropped off incense with a note. "Use this, please." You tried to make it livable. You really did. But homes need warmth. And you had nothing but work and gloves that never came off. Part 7, the man nobody talks to. Out in public, you were seen, but not acknowledged. In taverns, conversations bent around you. At markets, merchants gave you stale bread with fake smiles. You weren't feared exactly, just avoided. Like fog or illness. You tried talking once. A boy your age asked what you did. You said, "I learn how to keep people from breaking too soon." He never spoke to you again. You weren't lonely. You were separate. Other craftsmen had guilds. You had a man who once grunted approval at how you coiled rope. That was your version of community. Part 8, the room. It wasn't called anything specific, just that place. You called it your workspace. Others didn't call it anything at all. Stone walls, no windows, one torch bracket. A table in the center. Ropes like props in a failed play. Tools on the wall, not labeled, just known. Some looked like instruments. Others looked like punishments made solid. And the bucket, still in the corner, still unexplained, still cleaned but never discussed. You knew where everything hung. You aligned things daily. It wasn't a ritual, it was survival. Grior had taught you that mess equals mistakes, and mistakes were messy. Part 9, pain arithmetic. Nobody told you you'd need math, but you did. Not numbers on paper, but the kind you feel in your knuckles. Angles, leverage, resistance. 3 turns of the crank meant warning. 4 meant honesty. 5 meant confession, or something irreversible. You learned to read joints like other men read maps. 1 wrong adjustment, and the bishop had questions. 1 right turn, and the magistrate said, "Good work." You weren't wild, you were precise. Timing was everything. Pressure had rhythm, and you had a sense for it now. The worst part, you were rarely wrong. Part 10, reputation and silence. They didn't praise you, they just kept coming. A knock on your door meant someone had decided pain was useful today. A sack of coins might be left on your bench. No name, no note, just expectation. Magistrates asked for results. Priests asked for repentance. Merchants asked for reminders to rivals. You were never officially involved, just available. When the job was done, no one thanked you. No one even looked you in the eye. But the next time something needed doing, they always knew where to find you. You were the broom behind the door. Necessary, but never mentioned. Part 11. The man with the boots that echoed. Once you had the gloves and the apron, it was only a matter of time before they gave you the boots. Heavy-soled, ironclad at the toes, they made a sound, a dull, flat thud, that people learned to recognize long before they saw your face. You tried walking softly, but it didn't matter. Villagers still froze mid-sentence. Children were called indoors. Even dogs stopped barking, as if sensing something old and wrong. You weren't dressed like a monster, but you sounded like one. The boots weren't just for grip on slippery floors. They were a symbol, not of status, but of permanence, of being grounded where others tried to flee. You wore them everywhere, even when off duty, even when you didn't have to, because deep down you knew you were never really off duty. One afternoon you smiled at a girl near the well. She looked at your gloves, heard the sound of your steps, and dropped her bucket as if burned. You didn't try again. Your clothes were no longer clothes. They were armor, not to protect you from blades, but from belonging. Part 12. The house that hated you. They gave you a home, technically. A stone rectangle behind the town hall. Thick walls. A small hearth. A cot. Close enough to the dungeon that you didn't need a candle to find your way in the dark. The groans and chain clinks were enough. You tried to decorate. A chair. A wool blanket. A tapestry with red stitching. It fell within days. The walls rejected softness. Even your single potted plant gave up, curling into itself like it knew this house wasn't made for life. The smell was complicated. A stew of boiled herbs, damp wood, and the lingering memory of rust. Even when you scrubbed, the air refused to clear. A priest once left you a bag of incense and a note that said only, "Use this, please." The nearest neighbors were far enough to avoid eye contact, but close enough to hear your boots if you stepped out at night. You were your own neighborhood. Population. One human, one crow that watched you each morning from the roof beam, and one shadow that never quite left your bedroom corner. You didn't call it home. You just called it where I sleep. Part 13. The man nobody toasts. You were technically a public servant. The town paid you, or at least promised to, but that didn't mean you were part of the public. People saw you in the square and immediately became fascinated with anything but your direction. A pigeon, a stone, a crack in the ground. You once went to the local tavern on a holy day, hopping for something warm to drink and maybe, just maybe, a laugh. The room grew quiet, not hostile, just silent, as if joy had paused mid-step and decided to wait until you were gone. You paid like everyone else, but your cup was never quite clean, and the stew always came lukewarm. You didn't complain. That would mean starting a conversation. Invitations never arrived. Weddings, feasts, town announcements always must have gotten lost, or we thought you'd be busy with your tools. You weren't exiled, just uninvited, all the time. Even children knew. They didn't fear you like a villain from a bedtime tale. They avoided you like sickness, like heavy fog, like something too real to joke about. And so you became a whisper with a face, known, but not known well, essential, but never included. Part 14. A room not meant for names. Your workspace was never called by name. No plaque, no sign, no torture chamber like the plays suggest. Just a heavy wooden door at the back of the town hall. Locked, sealed, echoing. Inside, it was always the same. Cold, even in summer. One torch bracket. A large wooden table. Ropes coiled like forgotten promises. A bucket in the corner. Tools on the wall, not in a chest, not in drawers, but hung like paintings no one dared admire. You knew every tool's weight by memory. You didn't name them. No one did. They had shapes, sounds, quirks, the crank that squealed, the collar that clicked just before it tightened. Some people thought you were a brute, that you used force mindlessly, swinging steel like a butcher with too much energy. But they didn't see the care, the adjustments, the notes you scratched into wax tablets under vague phrases like moderate resistance observed, or subject became forthcoming at turn 4. You weren't just dealing pain. You were tuning it like an instrument. Precision mattered. One wrong move and the bishop had questions. One too many cracks, and suddenly you were the subject, not the servant. In this room, mistakes didn't bleed. They echoed. Part 15. Mathematics of misery. No one warned you that this work would involve calculations. Not money, not trade, but bones, leverage, and the line between agony and unconsciousness. You learned that the human shoulder can withstand 7 full turns of the wheel before the joint slips. That certain bones, clavicle, wrist, ankle whisper before they scream. That bruises bloom in different colors, depending on pressure and time. Your mind became a ledger of human limits, a record of what breaks and when. You could look at a man and know 3 minutes before he screams, 4 before he breaks, 5 before he lies about everything just to make it stop. You didn't enjoy it, but you couldn't unknow it either. This was your skill. This was your trade. And with that knowledge came something worse than guilt: reliability. The magistrates started calling you more often. The priests nodded instead of flinching. They trusted you, not because you were kind, but because you were consistent. You know what you're doing, they said. Give him the usual. And like stew on a rainy day, you delivered exactly what was expected. Part 16, Currency of Silence. You'd think a job that involved unlocking the truth, often by dislocating it, would come with a proper paycheck. But no, your compensation was inconsistent, unpredictable, and occasionally insulting. Officially, you worked for the town. Unofficially, you were paid through whatever scraps the magistrates could dig up: fines, hush money, and mysterious pouches left at your doorstep by desperate relatives, hoping their cousin might survive the questioning. One week it was silver coins, the next a wheel of half-rotten cheese. Once, they paid you with a chicken so scrawny it looked like it had already heard rumors about your profession. There was no salary ledger, no promises, just vague phrases like "your services are appreciated," which was bureaucratic for "don't ask." You kept a notebook, not for proof, just to feel like a man with a desk job, a man who existed beyond the wheel and the bucket. You once confronted the magistrate politely, explaining that vinegar cost coin, ropes frayed, and sharpening files wasn't free. He nodded thoughtfully, handed you a single copper coin, and said, "Thank you for your continued discretion." You couldn't threaten to quit. Who would take your place? And if you did walk away, what would your resume say? Experienced in pain management, anatomical resilience, and one-on-one crowd control. So you stayed, not because it paid well, but because leaving meant becoming something even more uncertain than what you already were. Part 17. The rules no one admitted. Torture in your time wasn't a lawless pit of madness, contrary to what outsiders believed. There were rules, not good ones, not clear ones, but they existed. You couldn't just wake up and decide someone looked suspicious. You needed approval from the magistrate, the priest, sometimes a noble with a grudge and an official seal. They called it justice. You called it delegation. In theory, torture was a last resort. In practice, it often followed 10 minutes of stern questioning and a sigh of impatience. You weren't allowed to maim permanently, at least not visibly. Broken limbs were frowned upon, unless, of course, the accused confessed. Then it was regrettable but effective. Records had to be kept. Kind of. Usually scratched into wax tablets with phrases like moderate encouragement applied, which could mean anything from a sharp glare to the fourth turn of a crank. A priest was often present, not to stop you, but to make sure the soul didn't wander off unrepentant. They mostly sat in the corner, offering theological debates or taking early lunch. Devices like Iron Maidens, mostly myth. You had to make do with what actually existed. Wooden wheels, steel collars, weighted chains, and one tool no one could explain. It rattled even when untouched. So yes, there were rules, but no one followed them unless someone powerful was watching. And even then, only when the floor was already clean. Part 18. The Man Who Faded. There was no retirement party for people like you. No medals. No final confession with a warm handshake and a well-earned rest. When you aged, you simply began shaking. Your hands stopped listening. Your knees popped like old hinges. And one day, you became a risk, not because you were cruel, but because your precision started to wobble. Grior never retired. One day, he gave you his gloves, nodded like he was handing down a pair of boots rather than a legacy, and walked out into the mist. No goodbye, no explanation. No one saw him again. Some whispered he died in peace. Others said he changed his name, tried to open a bakery, and was run out of town. Once people figured out their croissants came from a man who once operated the crank. You never made a plan to leave, because where would you go? You weren't a blacksmith or a potter. You were the man in the basement. That wasn't just a job. It was a role in the architecture of the town. Eventually, you'd fade like Grior, quietly, softly, into obscurity. But not yet, not today. You still had work to do. Part 19. The legacy you didn't choose. Years passed. Plagues swept through like seasonal gossip. Wars started, ended, and started again. New officials arrived, made speeches, and left. But you stayed. You were still there, the silent fixture behind the council hall, like a forgotten door hinge that somehow kept the whole building from collapsing. People didn't thank you. They didn't even say your name, just him or the one downstairs. Children made up stories about you. Teenagers dared each other to knock on your door. Adults avoided your gaze, but still expected you to appear when something went wrong. Among the officials, your name was spoken with a strange tone, not respect, not fear, but a sort of bureaucratic relief. Like a mop that always cleaned up the mess, no questions asked. You never married. Who would you introduce yourself to? Hello, I extract confession through calibrated discomfort. Care for a walk. Friends, maybe one. The apprentice you trained. He stopped asking questions. He learned the grip patterns, the cleaning rituals. He never thanked you, which meant he was learning properly. You once considered carving your initials into the bench in your workspace, a way to be remembered. But it felt pointless. The room remembered you already. Through scratches on the floor, through the echoes in the walls. Your legacy wouldn't be ink or stone. It would be silence. Part 20. After the crank stops. When your time came, and it would, no one would carry you out with trumpets or ceremony. You'd simply vanish. The door would remain locked a little longer than usual. People would whisper, but no one would knock. Eventually, someone would be chosen. Another boy, quiet, watchful, just curious enough to be dangerous. And they'd send him to the edge of the village, to a house with no garden and a man who doesn't smile. He would sweep the same floors, oil the same gears, read the same yellowed book with diagrams of skeletal tension. He would sit by the fire, gloves too big at first, and stare at the flames, wondering if they ever go out down there. And you would become a ghost with no name, a memory with heavy boots, a cautionary tale wrapped in leather and vinegar. But not yet, because this morning a magistrate knocked, and there's still work to do. Part 21. The invitation that was really a choice. To receive an invitation to a noble feast wasn't merely good fortune. It was strategy, surveillance, or a signal. It meant someone noticed you. Whether they liked you or were watching you closely was a separate question. There were no printed cards or wax-sealed RSVPs. The message often arrived by courier, dressed in the host's livery, holding a scroll or pouch, perfumed to impress or intimidate. The smell alone told you whether to be flattered or afraid. To decline such a summons was to flirt with exile. To arrive underdressed was to invite whispers. One absent dinner could turn into rumors of sickness, treason, or bankruptcy before the soup had cooled. Even the gentry, those minor nobles clawing for recognition, had to maneuver carefully to earn their seat. A recent land donation, a strategic marriage, or a conveniently timed debt forgiveness might buy your way in. But sometimes the invitation came without warning, and those were the most dangerous of all, because sometimes the meal wasn't the point. Sometimes you were the main course. Part 22. The theater of arrival. Nobody simply walked into a banquet. Entrance was a performance. Arrival was your first test. The courtyard outside the hall would blaze with torchlight. Banners fluttered in anticipation, while the scent of burning wood, perfume, and horses mingled thick in the air. Trumpets signaled each new guest. Hooves clattered. Carriages gleamed. Knights rode not with armor, but in silks embroidered with family crests and veiled warnings. Behind them, attendants carried token gifts, rare spices, tapestries, jeweled birds, or letters, dressed up as offerings, but really statements. The subtle guests came too, cloaked in black, slipping through side gates, leaving no trail but whispered questions. Spies, rivals, shadow courtiers with agendas tucked under their sleeves. At the doors of the great hall, heralds stood with scrolls as long as sermons. Each guest's name was announced with theatrical exaggeration. Lord Edrin, keeper of the southern pines, victor of the river duel, patron of 3 choirs, long enough for the bread to grow stale before he sat. And as they entered, every head turned, not out of politeness, but to assess who smiled who flinched, who dared to wear red in a hall ruled by blue. Because at a noble feast, food was secondary. Power was always the main dish. Part 23. The table was the map. The seating wasn't random. It was cartography. It showed alliances, hostilities, social standing, and warnings. Where you sat was who you were. At the raised table, the dais, sat the lord or lady of the manor, flanked by their most trusted, or feared, or useful. The closer you were to the host's goblet, the more eyes you had on your every word. Farther down the room were the lesser nobles, the forgotten knights, the ambitious merchants, and the clerics hopping to remain relevant. Near the kitchen entrance sat those who were either tolerated out of obligation, or one wrong phrase away from disgrace. And then there was the salt. To sit above the salt was to matter. The rare white mineral was placed near the important guests. Those below the salt were still eating, but not truly present. It was a grainy line between influence and invisibility. If you were seated beside someone powerful, congratulations, you had a chance. If your assigned place was next to someone whispered to be unwell, overly bold, or recently forgiven, you were in political quicksand. Here, even where you reached for the wine told a story. Part 24. The feast was a stay. The moment the host raised their goblet, the room fell into a silent hush. It was not reverence, it was readiness. Because now the performance began. Dishes did not arrive. They paraded. First courses came out in waves. Bread carved with family crests, sweetened roots shaped like birds, wines from lands where grapes grew near legends. Later came spectacle. Roasted beasts wearing crowns of herbs, pies that hissed when opened, towering sugar sculptures painted with edible gold. This wasn't about hunger. It was demonstration. To show what lands you controlled, what spices you could afford, and what cooks you commanded. Guests used knives, rarely forks. Trenches of stale bread caught the drippings, later tossed to dogs, beggars, or forgotten guests. You weren't meant to eat everything. You were meant to be seen eating correctly. Tear the meat too hungrily, and you were savage. Refuse a dish, and it meant you distrusted the host. The table wasn't a meal. It was a battlefield of forks and glances, and you had to choose your bites with the precision of a duelist. Part 25. Between the bites, the blades. As plates were cleared and new ones arrived, something else unfolded beneath the silver and sugar. Negotiation, manipulation, betrayal. Gestures performed, but their jokes were coded warnings. A slip of the tongue disguised as rhyme could spark a feud or hide one. Musicians played courtly tunes, but conversations continued beneath the melody. Hushed voices behind goblets, smiles held too long, toasts given with forced cheer. Alliances were struck between bites of venison. Vendettas rekindled over spilled sauce. Sometimes a dance was offered, not for courtship, but to pull someone away from dangerous ears. Servants moved like ghosts, trained to listen more than they served. What they overheard could be worth more than the feast itself. One wrong word, one mistimed gesture, one accidental smirk during a toast, and you could find yourself seated much closer to the door next time, if there was a next time, because in these halls, secrets were the richest dessert, and everyone had an appetite. Part 26. After the second goblet, the first drink was polite, the second strategic. By the third, masks began to slip. Laughter grew louder. Language loosened. Guests who had spent hours measuring every word now gestured wildly, eyes glassy, truths leaking from behind their wine-stained teeth. This was not an accident. The wine was strong, the pace of refilling relentless. A calculated unraveling designed to blur alliances, test loyalty, and expose the cracks beneath lacquered civility. Some nobles grew louder, others quieter, calculating the effects of others, loosening tongues. Courtiers drifted between tables, fishing for phrases that could be useful later. And the host, always watching, never drunk, because in banquets like these, it was never about the food. It was about what people said after forgetting who was listening. Part 27. The Dance of Daggers. When the music shifted, rising into quicker rhythms and trembling strings, the dancing began. Or, more accurately, the duel in silk. Men and women took to the floor, smiling too widely, holding hands too briefly. Each step was deliberate, each spin a statement. To accept a dance was to endorse. To refuse one was to wound. Lords offered their hands to rivals' daughters. Widows danced with married men under the watchful eye of their wives. It wasn't romance. It was negotiation with rhythm. But not all dancers came for subtlety. Some arrived with intentions like sharpened blades, hidden behind fans and flattery. Words whispered between steps. He's losing land. She paid off the bishop. Watch his left hand. The floor turned into a moving maze of plots. And in the corners, those who couldn't or wouldn't dance, the fallen, the sickly, the out of favor, stared with tight jaws, knowing that tonight's steps could decide next month's exiles. Part 28. Behind the curtains. Beyond the flickering torchlight and the clatter of cutlery, there were quieter halls, side chambers, tapestried corridors where business whispered instead of shouted. This was where the real deals were made. Behind thick velvet curtains, dukes met with mercenaries. Barons exchanged letters too sensitive for daylight. Gold changed hands. Promises were sealed with a handshake and sealed again with veiled threats. Lovers met here too, though love was rarely the point. A quick tryst could mean silence, a favor owed, a blackmail seed planted gently. Servants, the ones no one saw, had their own networks. A kitchen boy could carry more secrets than a diplomat. A chambermaid could trade gossip for protection. And always, there was one door locked, guarded, scented with lavender or cloves, to hide what truly went on within. Not every guest made it to these rooms, only the ones who understood that the banquet center was never the table. Part 29. The night cracks. Every great feast has its tipping point. The moment when control falters, decorum cracks, and the wine finally wins. It might begin with a chair overturned in laughter, or a song sung too loudly, too slurred, a guest slipping under the table, unaware or uncaring of how they'd be remembered. Fights sometimes broke out, not duels with swords, but with spit, curses, and hurled goblets. Accidental spills became accusations. Playful insults revealed ancient grudges. Musicians played faster, trying to mask the shift. Servants moved faster, trying to contain the mess. But the night had begun to rot from within. By now, food lay abandoned. Half-eaten peacocks, crumbling pastry towers, a river of wine trailing down the steps, and somewhere, perhaps in the corner, a noble laughed too loudly, because sometimes chaos was the point. It showed who could survive it and who couldn't. Part 30. When the candles burn low. By the time the great hall emptied, the air was heavy, thick, with spilled wine, smoke, secrets, and exhaustion. Guests staggered out, carried out, or disappeared entirely. The torches were dimming. The musicians' fingers ached. The jesters were gone, but the consequences were just beginning. A deal whispered during a dance would echo in tomorrow's council chamber. A glance exchanged behind the curtain might turn into a scandal by dawn. A spilled cup near a general could fuel suspicion for weeks. The servants cleaned in silence. They knew better than to speak. Every goblet held fingerprints, every torn hem a story, and the host, still seated, still smiling, still calculating, because a true lord didn't feast to feed. They feasted to test the world and see who choked on it. Part 31. Where the water was warm and the eyes were watching. A medieval bathhouse was more than warm water and soap-root. It was a place where the rigid hierarchy of outside began to melt, just slightly, in the rising steam. Stone buildings, some grand and public, others secretive and hidden, were filled with clashing aromas: boiled herbs, sweat, perfume, and wet linen. The soundscape was a mix of splashing, sighs, and the occasional scandalous laugh that echoed too loudly to be innocent. Rich and poor alike could be found here, stripped of armor, silks, or shame, submerged in water that carried more than heat. They came for different reasons. The laborer sought relief from a week of grime. The noble came to soften his skin before seducing a rival's wife. The merchant came to listen, not bathe, because bathhouses were where secrets slipped between conversations. It was not the cleanest place, ironically, but it was the most honest. No one looked each other directly in the eye. That was too dangerous, too revealing. In the bathhouse, everyone was exposed, but only some were vulnerable. Part 32. The Ritual of the Scrub. Before you even touched water, there were steps. Almost sacred, almost surgical. First, you stripped. Not behind curtains, not discreetly. Just in line with the rest, among strangers who pretended not to notice. Then came the scraping. Attendants, often with rough cloths, sometimes with fishbone combs or pumice, scrubbed layers of filth, oil, and regret from your skin. It hurt. It bled. It was necessary. Some nobles brought their own servants for this task. Others paid extra to be handled more gently. But gentleness was rare. The idea wasn't to pamper, it was to purify. And as your skin turned raw and pink, your mind cleared too. You forgot your title, forgot your debts, forgot who you owed or who owed you. You were just a body, a sweating, sore, steaming body. But then came the water. Warm, deep, heavy with herbs, lavender, sage, sometimes vinegar to kill whatever you carried in with you. You sank into it like it was a second womb. And for a few moments, you remembered how to breathe. Part 33. The steam that concealed everything. The room filled with mist, so thick you couldn't always tell who sat beside you. And that was part of the draw. Businessmen made deals here, voices lowered just enough to sound like moans of comfort. Courtiers passed messages, whispered across tiles, passed in wet linen, or tapped out through attendants. Lovers met here under pretense of back scrubs. Spies, too, professional or amateur, slinked between benches, pretending to relax while memorizing faces. Rumors were born in these waters. The Baroness is pregnant. The bishop's robe has blood at the hem. There's plague 2 villages east. Not all of it was true. But in a place where everyone sweated the same, truth didn't matter, believability did. Not all visitors came with clean intentions. Some came with diseases that no herb could boil out. Others came for temptation. There were attendants with more than soap to offer, if you had the coin and the courage. The bathhouse was where the body cleansed itself, and the soul quietly dirtied again. Part 34. The Unspoken Rules. The bathhouse had no posted laws, but everyone followed them or paid the price. You did not stare. You did not mention scars unless invited. You did not ask why someone of noble birth was sitting beside a butcher. You especially did not talk about what happened the last time that night bathed here. There was an understanding. What happened beneath the steam stayed in the mist. Unless, of course, you broke the rules, then it followed you, whispering in corners, spreading faster than illness. Some bathhouses had private rooms. You paid more, got less. A narrow space with a single tub, thin walls, and the illusion of secrecy. That illusion was worth more than the bath itself. The finest houses had musicians. Flutes, gentle drums, women singing in dialects no one understood, but everyone claimed to love. The sounds distracted you, made you feel less exposed, less aware of the hand that lingered too long while passing a cloth. If something went wrong, a deal soured, a tryst turned violent, a rumor proven true, no one screamed. That was another rule. You didn't scream in the bathhouse. You simply left and never came back. Part 35. After the water cooled, when the baths were done and your skin hung loose from heat and scrubbing, you stepped back into your clothes, no longer noble, no longer commoner, just someone a little lighter. You walked out into the street, hair damp, skin red, brain spinning with what you saw, what you heard, what you imagined. You felt cleaner, but not purer. Sometimes you felt worse, because water could wash away dirt, but not what you overheard, not what you said, not what was offered. You carried the bathhouse with you for hours. The smell of herbs clung to your clothes. The heat stayed in your bones. You could still hear the laughter, the dripping, the whispers that sounded like truths or traps. You wondered if you'd return. You always did, because in a world filled with mud, chains, and blood, a little steam was worth the risk. Part 36, where the road had no end. It wasn't really one road. It was 1,000 veins crisscrossing continents, forming a tangled circulatory system that pulsed with trade, danger, and deceit. They called it the Silk Road, but it carried more than silk: gold, spices, fur, jade, secrets, stories, religions, corpses. From the coastal markets of China to the marble courtyards of Byzantium, it stretched like an unfinished thought across deserts, mountains, and empires. No single traveler completed it end to end. Those who claimed they did were liars, ghosts, or madmen. You didn't survive the Silk Road, you passed through it, if you were lucky. And to walk, it was to gamble with your life daily. Not only against bandits, sandstorms, or imperial taxes, but against the road itself. Because the road wanted things: your goods, your blood, your belief. And it always took something. Part 37. The market that never slept. Every few hundred miles, the dust lifted to reveal a town, not a city in the modern sense, but a crossroads, a staging area, a pause between perils. And every town had a market. Not stalls, realms. Rows of tents and domes packed with fabrics glowing in the sun. Spices so strong they made your throat itch just passing them. Coins from kingdoms you couldn't pronounce. Merchants spoke 6 languages badly and bartered in 12 more. Translation was half mimicry, half bluff. You didn't need grammar to sell a tiger pelt. You just needed confidence and a knife nearby in case the deal turned bad. Dealers in silk were treated like royalty or threats. Silk was light, luxurious, and incredibly valuable. It wasn't just cloth, it was currency, and everyone wanted a piece. You never raised your voice in the market. You didn't need to. Deals whispered behind raised hands often changed more borders than wars did. The road was long. The desert was cruel. But the market, that was the heartbeat. Part 38. dust, death, and caravan bells. To cross the Silk Road, you needed a caravan, not just for your goods, but for your life. Camels moved like ancient ships across sand, steady, stubborn, contemptuous of your existence. They carried spice crates, rugs, weapons, and dreams wrapped in oilskin. But more importantly, they carried water. The desert didn't kill quickly. It waited. First, it took your sweat, then your sense of direction, then your friends, then your mind. Bandits watched from ridges, like vultures who hadn't grown wings yet. They didn't want to fight, they wanted to surprise. If they attacked, it was because they were certain they'd win. You didn't run. You dropped everything and hoped your boots were too old to be worth killing over. At night, you gathered around small fires, clutching your pouch of salt, or your jade amulet like it could stop frostbite or treachery. You didn't sleep. Not really. The bells on the camels chimed in the wind like warnings. Something was always coming. Part 39. The Compass of Belief. The road wasn't just a trade route. It was a path of gods, of ghosts, of questions. Every region had its own shrines. A stone carved with a prayer in one language, defaced in another, repainted in a third. Buddhist monks passed Christian pilgrims, who passed Sufi mystics, who argued with Zoroastrian firekeepers. None of them agreed, but all of them bowed to something. Amulets hung from every neck, not always for faith, sometimes just for luck or fear. A trader might wear a Buddha on one wrist and a crucifix on the other, not because he believed in both, but because he'd passed through lands where each had power. You learned quickly not to mock beliefs, even ones that made no sense to you. Not because they were sacred, but because belief protected people. On the Silk Road, anything that offered protection was sacred enough. People changed on this road. Some became holy, some became hollow. Most just kept walking. Hopping the next mile would be gentler than the last. Part 40. The city that wasn't a city. And then, after days of thirst, hunger, paranoia, and silence, you arrive at one of the cities of the Silk Road. A mirage made real. Samarkand, Kashgar, Merv. Names that sounded like promises. They weren't like cities in the West. No cathedrals, no moats, no courts. But they pulsed with color. Tiles shimmered like wet jewels. Minarets pierced blue skies. Courtyards overflowed with musicians, astronomers, thieves, and philosophers. You could buy a glass of fermented mares, milk, and hear a Mongol chieftain argue metaphysics with a Greek physician. Maps were drawn here, empires predicted, plots conceived, and somewhere, in a sunlit room behind a curtain of beads, a trader placed a bolt of silk on a table. One hand rested on his dagger. The other extended the fabric like it held a kingdom, because in these cities, power didn't shout. It whispered in trade, in ink, in silk. Part 41. The bargain you regret later. Every traveler on the Silk Road eventually makes a deal they wish they hadn't. It could be as small as paying triple for water in a desert outpost, or as monumental as trading a caravan of goods for safe passage through a warlord's territory. The trouble was, you often didn't know it was a mistake until much later, when the water turned out to be spoiled, or the warlord decided your promise was worth more than your life. Sometimes the worst bargains weren't even with other people. They were with yourself. You told yourself you'd only risk one more desert crossing, one more dangerous pass, one more season away from home. The Silk Road was seductive that way. It made you feel like the next trade would make you rich enough to stop. But the road never wanted you to stop. Part 42. The toll you don't see coming. On paper, the road's dangers were obvious. Bandits, disease, weather. But the real toll was slower, quieter. Your body stiffened from endless days riding or walking. Your hearing dulled from wind. Your eyes narrowed against glare until you forgot what green looked like. You learned to sleep lightly, eat sparingly, trust almost no one. Some travelers returned home to find themselves unable to rest in a bed, unable to enjoy quiet. They craved the noise of markets, the smell of camel sweat, the constant threat that had kept them sharp. The road took your comfort and replaced it with vigilance. Even after you left it, the road stayed inside you. Part 43. The things worth more than silk. Silk gave the road its name, but it was never the only treasure. Some traders carried paper, fragile, revolutionary, destined to change empires. Others dealt in glassware, so clear it seemed impossible. Jade traveled both ways. Spices worth their weight in gold rode hidden under sacks of grain. And then there were the treasures you couldn't weigh or price. Songs, recipes, words. A Persian lullaby could find its way into a Chinese port. An herbal cure from India might end up in a monastery in Italy. Ideas moved faster than caravans, slipping between languages, blending into something new before anyone could claim them. The road's greatest wealth was never just what you carried. It was what you carried home. Part 44. The shadow caravans. For every honest trader, there were shadow caravans, groups who traveled by night, avoiding official routes, selling things the law forbade. Opium, stolen relics, forbidden books, even people. They moved like smoke, impossible to catch unless they wanted to be caught. Sometimes they were protected by the same officials sworn to stop them. Sometimes they were entire families, born into smuggling, knowing no other life. You could do business with them. Many did, but you paid a different kind of price, the kind that followed you across borders, whispered in dark alleys. The road had an official face, clean and proud, but it also had a pulse in the shadows, where gold and blood were the same color. Part 45. When the road closes behind you. The Silk Road was never permanent. A war here, a collapsed bridge there, a new tax decree. and suddenly a route you relied on was gone. When that happened, towns withered, inns stood empty, wells turned to dust. Merchants who had been kings of their trade woke up penniless. The road could vanish behind you as quickly as it had opened before you. That's why some travelers took what they could, when they could, without waiting for the right time. Because on the Silk Road, the right time was always yesterday. Part 46. The Ghosts Along the Path. The road had its ghosts. Some were real, bleached bones half buried in sand, abandoned wagons in mountain passes. Others were stories told to keep the young cautious. The phantom caravan that followed you in fog. The trader who spoke to no one, but always arrived first at market. These ghosts weren't always warnings. Sometimes they were comfort, a reminder that the road belonged to no one. Not the kings who taxed it, not the merchants who walked it, not even the cities that thrived because of it. The road belonged to the dead as much as the living. Part 47. The return that isn't a return. Going home after years on the Silk Road was strange. You brought riches, yes. Stories, yes. But you had changed in ways home couldn't understand. The streets felt too small. The food too plain. People gossiped about weather while you remembered nights in cities where stars and lanterns outshone each other. Some merchants never stayed. They left again within weeks, because once you'd walked the Silk Road, you couldn't unlearn the horizon. Part 48. The Imitators. As word of the Silk Road's wealth spread, others tried to copy it. New roads sprung up, smaller, safer, closer to home. None had the same magic. They lacked the risk, the vastness, the sense that every step might change your life or end it. They could move goods, yes, but they couldn't move souls. The true Silk Road wasn't a place on a map. It was an ordeal, a gamble, a temptation. And those things can't be imitated. Part 49. The Last Trade. Every traveler eventually makes their final deal on the Silk Road. Sometimes it's deliberate, selling the last bolt of cloth before turning home. Sometimes it's forced, robbed in the night, left with nothing to sell. In that moment, you feel the road slipping away. It doesn't matter if you made a fortune or barely survived. The road doesn't remember you. It takes your last trade the same way it took your first, without thanks. Part 50. What the road leaves behind. When you finally step off the Silk Road, there's no ceremony, no applause, no carved stone to mark the end. It simply fades. The caravan turns a corner. The dust settles. The road disappears behind you like a dream you're not sure you had. You carry no banners, only scars. Your skin is weathered. Your hands know the weight of coins from a dozen kingdoms. And your ears still ring with the music of languages you'll never master. You remember heat that could blister bone, cold that could kill a man before sunrise, and nights when the stars looked close enough to steal. You remember the smell of cinnamon in a market where you almost lost your life, the sound of camel bells at dawn, the taste of wine so rare it felt like sin. And though your pack may be lighter now, your mind is heavier, stuffed with faces, deals, betrayals, kindnesses, and the endless knowledge that the road was always bigger than you. Because in truth, you never owned the Silk Road. It owned you. Long after your last trade, you'll still wake in the night, certain you hear those caravan bells in the wind. You'll still taste the desert when dust catches on your tongue. And you'll still, sometimes, feel the urge to follow a horizon, any horizon, just to see what waits beyond it. The Silk Road doesn't end when your journey does. It keeps moving in other travelers, in other deals, in other lifetimes. And one day, someone will walk where you walked, never knowing your name, only feeling the pull of that same invisible thread. Because the true legacy of the Silk Road isn't the silk, the gold, or the cities. It's the way it changes those who dare to follow it. And once it changes you, there's no road back.